CNC hatred. Is it a thing? Hey, I'm Walter Sorrells, back with another Knife Makers Friday 5. I've done hundreds of videos about making knives. Some of them are about forging, some of them are about using belt grinders, some of them are about using hand tools, all kinds of different approaches. It seems like every time that I do something about CNC, and that's basically, for those of you who aren't aware of it, CNC is basically using a computer to drive a mill that does certain operations on the knife. Every time I do anything about CNC, I always get a few people who are unsubscribing and freaking out about it, and it seems like it's kind of a little flashpoint. And so I wanted to kind of explore, why that might be, and maybe, why I think the folks that get all butthurt about CNC are missing the boat when it comes to blades made by individual makers. So here's why I think folks sometimes get disturbed about CNC with respect to individual maker knives. I think the idea is that the real value of a knife made by one dude is that, they've put personal attention into it, used their hands on it, they've kind of breathed life into that. And the notion is that if CNC is involved, then that attention to the individual knife goes out the window. So before I sort of get into why I use CNC and what its role is in my own shop, let me talk a little bit about some what I think are myths about CNC. The first myth is that basically CNC is push a button, doink, out comes a knife. This is complete BS. It doesn't work that way at all. In my own personal case, I program the thing, I do the fixturing, I often run the machine itself. And so even though there's this machine involved, it's all a product of my own mind. So what comes out of that machine has my fingerprints on it in a big way. So if you're an individual maker or working in the context of a fairly small shop, where does CNC fall in terms of processes versus forging and all these other kind of cool things that you see people doing that seem to be much more hands-on? Well, in my case, the real reason that I use CNC first is to eliminate the stupidest, most boring parts of my job. If you go back and you look at a lot of, take Bob Loveless, for instance. He's kind of the quintessential example of how the modern hand knife making guy works. Call him a custom maker or whatever. If you've read his book, you'll see that he had a bunch of kind of standard designs, and he used little templates, and he would mark them out on a piece of steel, and then he would grind and cut the edges out, the profile out with a belt grinder and maybe a bandsaw and stuff. And then he would drill the holes with a mill. So if you're kind of running an operation like Lovelace did in his day, and he's sadly passed on now, but there are plenty of other knife makers who do pretty similar sorts of things. People like to be able to go and say, oh yeah, this is a certain kind of knife that this maker makes, and I want to buy that model. So in order to produce those on a routine basis, you have to have some way of consistently making that same knife over and over. And you can do that on a belt grinder and with a hand-operated mill and so forth, but it's a very routine, uninteresting process, kind of slow. And, if you can take some of that time out of your day to spend on more high-skill operations, fit and finish, design, all those kinds of things that really, to me, are what are the hallmarks of, what you're paying for when you pay a couple $100, $300, $400 for a knife. What you're really paying for is quality. And, you know, if an individual knife maker can take some of the time out of their day that they spend on really stupid routine processes and spend them on maybe the more interesting and ultimately more important processes, then what you're actually getting from a guy who's using CNC is you're getting more of his high skill time and his attention on heat treating and these various other more important things, and less on these kind of routine sides of the job. So the second point here, and this really gets back to, you know, what is it that you most want when you pay a couple $100, $300, $400 for a knife? To me, the most important thing you want is a good knife. So the advantage of CNC is that it allows you to make certain parts of your knives extremely consistently and precisely. And that results in a better knife in the hands of the buyer. So I have to assume that part of the animosity towards CNC is that some people like to imagine that craftsmen spend all day doing whatever it is. If they're chair makers, they spend 8, 10, 12 hours a day making chairs. If they're jewelers, they spend 8, 10, 12 hours a day making jewelry. As a knife maker, you're a businessman. What that means is that on any given day, you're making knives. That's, you know, job one, but you're also talking on the phone, you're answering emails from customers, you're trying to get the word out, you're doing marketing stuff. You know, that's part of the reason that I do these videos, is to get the word out about my products. You're mailing packages, wrapping things up, you're buying supplies, you're going to Office Depot to buy more paper for your printer. I mean, there's just an endless list of things that you know, a knife maker has to do every day in order to put food on their table and make sure their kids get fed. So my number one goal as a knife maker, you know, in the context of me as a small shop type guy, is to make the best knife that I can for the money that I charge. And so one little piece of what I do gets carved off and taken care of by CNC. It's still a, you know, you can't believe how much work is involved in, you know, setting up CNC operations, doing all the fixturing, design, all that kind of stuff. There are a lot of benefits to it, but anybody who thinks that push a button, out comes a knife is living in a dream world. I still love getting in front of the forge. I love hammering out that knife, that interplay of the fire and the hammer and all that. But the reality is, I can't pay for my kids' college tuition by spending all day hammering on the forge. So there are a lot of different pieces that come into play in producing any given knife, and CNC, for me, it's just one of those tools. It's just like a screwdriver or a belt grinder or a hammer or a forge, just part of the whole workflow. So speaking of that, next Friday, hopefully, I'm going to do another video where I kind of talk about my personal workflow, how CNC fits into my workflow, and really how it allows me to focus on those kind of higher skill, more interesting parts of the job that ultimately result in a better knife that I can deliver to my customer. All right, see you next week. Thanks for watching, guys. If you feel like you got something out of this video, don't forget to subscribe. Also, click on the link to Patreon for a great way to give back to the channel. Plus, check me out on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Links in the description. If you want something sharp and pointy, maybe a gift for yourself or one of the cooler people in your life, check out my Tactics Armory website and pick up one of our tactical or outdoor knives. And finally, if you want to learn to make Hamones or Japanese swords, check out WalterSorrellsBlades.com, where you can find videos about how I make Hamones, as well as forging, mounting, polishing, and fittings for Japanese swords. Thanks, and see you soon.